Policy Research. I'm Lisa Garcia-Beloya, I'm the chair of the center. And it is my distinct pleasure today to introduce Zimmerman, our speaker for today. I've had the privilege of knowing Annalise now. She corrected me for 14 years. We clearly met when you were an infant. And I've been able to see her. We met when she was an undergraduate, and see her through her graduate career. She got her PhD in political science at UCLA. And despite the fact that she came out of that department, she manages to do very interesting and creative work that really bridges a whole set of discipline fields within political science and within, I think, probably sociology, social science in general. She is currently an Andrew Mellon Postdoctoral Fellow at USC, working under Dr. Manuel Pastor. And her work really brings together political theory, social movement theory, transnational politics, in order to really think about all the ways in which human beings organize and construct their ideas of belonging across borders. And so today we have the privilege of hearing a part of her book project, which is really looking at this kind of transnational organizing among Central Americans in different spaces. And I also just wanted to bring your attention to our next talk, which is Celia Lacayo, who is one of our own. She's a Berkeley grad student in ethnic studies, yay, who's going to be here talking about her work in December. So please take a flyer and join us for that. And I have to apologize to you because I double booked myself, so I'm going to have to leave in a few minutes. But I'm very privileged to have Annalise here and excited to hear about her great work.
Lisa actually described my work much more eloquently than I could, so I'm like, okay, I have to follow it up. No. So the talk today is titled Contesting Citizenship, Central American Belonging in an Anti-Immigrant U.S. Climate. And I actually have to thank Veronica and Lisa, not only for inviting me here, but for helping me with that title, because I usually have very long, lengthy titles. And I think this really captures the sort of the spirit of the talk. So, no, but in all seriousness, thank you, Veronica and Lisa.
Small, so we need
I know. Thank you all. I'm just so thrilled. I'm usually quite nervous before talks, and nervousness has given way to utter excitement to be here and sharing this work in progress with you. So I want to root my talk because we've just had, the exciting election, and we're going to be hearing so much about Latino immigrant engagement and how important the Latino vote was with the elections a few days ago. And we're going to be hearing a lot of numbers, right? Numbers about how the Latino electorate shifted the landscape across the United States. But what we're not going to be hearing about, and largely because we can't quantify it, is the ways and the broader ways in which Latino immigrants have really participated, not only in the elections, right, but how they participate more broadly. And I was thinking when I was preparing my remarks for the talk, because this is, I think the theme for this semester is really participation, right? All year, okay?
Political engagement.
The theme for the talk is political engagement. So I wanted to situate my talk within this context. That, and I was thinking when I was preparing my talk about the undocumented youth, in which I've been working with and in collaboration with over the last year, and their campaigns, right, about make the pledge, become a dream voter, right? And like this kind of image or this kind of idea made me think about the ways in which Latino immigrants are participating in ways that we can't necessarily immediately see, or in ways that we can, quantify. And sort of thinking about that theme leads me to sort of think about the work that I've been doing with my book project and with my dissertation about how these kind of forms of immigrant engagement have been rooted in a very long history, particularly in Los Angeles, of Central American migrant communities, right? That as far back as this poster was a relic of 1983 in the Central American Peace and Solidarity Movement. Even back then, you had communities, refugee communities, that didn't have any kind of formal status, didn't have legal status, but yet were engaged in rights-claiming practices. So this is a poster that was, designed by Elie Wiesel, and I don't know if I'm saying that correctly, but the, very notorious activist who says, in the United States, we demand the right to work, to stop deportations, and in El Salvador, we want the right to live in a place, in our place of origin and stop military operations. So even back as far back as 1983, right? And we can even extend it even more previously. We've had these examples of transnational rights claiming practices from a community that has not had formal, legal recognition in the United States. So, because my talk is based primarily on ethnographic work, I wanted to show you sort of snapshots of what that immigrant engagement looks like in a city like Los Angeles and in community-based organizations where I situate my work. This is photos from Carecen, the Central American Resource Center in Los Angeles, that also has its partner organization here in San Francisco. And on any given day, you see immigrants engaging in the kind of broader forms of participation, not just voting or electoral participation. And I remember so vividly, because this talk is based on a paper that's under submission and under review right now. And I remember so vividly walking into the Carecen offices. I was a graduate student, new to ethnographic field work, nervous about talking to people. And I remember interviewing the executive director at the time. His name is Marvin Andrade. And I didn't even have to prompt him. My interest was in citizenship. But when I asked him, Marvin, what do you do here at Carecen? And he said, this is really about active participation. You don't have to be a citizen, he says, and this is directly from the interview that I had from him. He says, one does not necessarily need to be a US citizen to be active. You can participate and be an engaged citizen. I think if you're a permanent resident or someone on TPS, and even undocumented, you can be active. And so, and then there's this poster hanging on the community hall of Carecen, pointing to active learning, active citizenship. And so the paradox of it, the irony of it really, right? That you're entering an immigrant organization and a space in which a large percentage of the people that they serve and the people that they organize with actually don't have formal legal status. Right, so we have quite a bit of work, Lisa's work and a lot of others that have kind of given context to why or how, what conditions immigrants engage, immigrants mobilize when they don't have citizenship, right? So this has been something that a lot of interesting work has emerged about this. The thing that really compelled me though, because I'm a political theorist and was working around theories of citizenship at the time, was to really see that in the literature, you really didn't see an account for what citizenship could mean in an immigrant context, right? And especially around a structural context in which people were being excluded from legal status. And now, going back to the time of Central Americans when they were struggling for legalization, now this issue has become front and center, right, in theories of citizenship. So some of the stuff that really, motivated me to use this experience of Central Americans were these driving questions, right? What interpretations of citizenship were emerging in this anti-immigrant context, and how did the lived experience of those without formal legal recognition and rights inform theories of citizenship, right? In relation not only to legal status, racial, social categories, participation, and membership. And one of the things, right, as a graduate student, because you have to look at theory and go, this theory just doesn't work for me, right? But it's true, it didn't work for me, right? Like the limits of theory, of citizenship theory, and I would argue still today, there's a big gap in understanding, the relationship between legal status and citizenship, which seems just, almost ridiculous, right? It's like, how could we not be, as political theorists, understanding the relationship between legal status and citizenship? But there's a historic, sort of reason for that. In some ways, citizenship has been conceptualized by most in a way that divides it between the passive and active dimensions of citizenship rooted in the state or rooted in civil society, right? And so the passive and the state-granted sort of conceptions is rights-based approaches, right? So the idea that citizenship is just rooted in rights, and it's a passive thing, right? If you're a citizen, you get a lot of these kinds of rights and obligations, right? And then there's the idea of citizenship rooted in civil society, right? So the famous bowling league, right? Robert Putnam's famous idea of what it means to be a member in civil society. And then the active dimensions of citizenship, which is really where a lot of immigrant political engagement studies situate themselves, right? The idea of transnationalism from below, right? What that really is referring to is, rights claiming practices, cultural citizenship, this kind of stuff, rooted in the active dimensions and agency-based, really, definitions. But the fact, though, is that the reason why legal status is something that's been under-theorized in many ways is because legal status would fall in this box, right? And then there's been, a lack of understanding about how legal status is really something that, intersects and informs these other kinds of forms of belonging and membership in civil society, right? And so legal status has oftentimes been bracketed, right, from the kind of affective dimensions of belonging, the ways in which racial and social identity form, and modes of political participation. So there's been a lack of, I would say, intersectional approaches to the study of citizenship. And, Linda Bosniak, who's my idol, she says, she says, there's a widespread tendency amongst many political and legal theorists to treat the subject of national citizenship asystematically and analytically separate from the rest of the citizenship field. But the question of legal status, and this is my voice now, is deeply interwoven with questions of race and ethnicity, gender, and other categories of belonging. So what to do, right? When theory is not helping you and you have this case where clearly legal status extends beyond just status, right? It goes into everyday life and every nook and cranny of people's daily lives. You go outside of political science. That's usually what you do. So for all you non-political scientists, you go out of political science, right? And so, May Nye and Nicholas de Genova, I think, are two key people that have been really helpful for me in kind of developing the analytical framework for this case. And the reason being is because their work does three things, and it does it pretty effectively. One is that they talk about legal status as something, as legality or illegality, right? Which is really extending status into everyday life. At least that's my interpretation of it. Two, they talk about legality as part of racial formation. And three, they talk about how these things intersect in daily life through the category of deportability, right, of immigrant deportability. So not the fact that you actually be deported, like in Romney's idea of self-deportation, but that you are deportable. It's a, yeah, okay.
Well, just Mac batteries being what they are.
Yeah, that's true. So, so May Nye talks about how illegality is a defining characteristic of racial formation of Asian and Latino groups, a permanent condition passed from generation to generation, adhering to even native-born citizens. De Genova talks about legality as a socio-political condition. So again, this kind of impulse and this intent of bringing legal status into the realm of sociological analysis, right? So in the case of Central Americans, this has been very useful and very helpful. Cecilia Menjivar has used this work and used this idea in her own work on developing the idea of legal liminality for Central Americans. And the thing about legal liminality is that it's not that legality becomes really useful because oftentimes status today, because of complex immigration policy, is no longer, citizen, non-citizen, right? It's citizen, LPR, asylum seeker, temporary protected status, stay of deportation. There's so many multiple categories in which immigrants are now placed in. And this is what she talks about in this long quote, right? That Central Americans' immediate experiences with illegality shape if and when immigrants acquire citizenship, what meanings they attach to it, their long-term prospects for incorporation. So the point of her work in expressing this idea in terms of legal liminality is that even after immigrants acquire legal status, right, the emotional and psychological dimensions of their experiences with illegality extend beyond the actual status changing, right? And that, secondly, that legal status can really be even thought of as a sort of dichotomous category, right? That there's multiple categories in which to understand this. And so for the case of Central Americans, I mean, this is a snapshot of the different categories in which Central Americans have crossed into the realm of legal status, right? And you'll see here that a large percentage of this pie has been a cancellation of removal, almost half of Central American migrants coming in through the Civil War migration was a fancy way of saying you were issued deportation orders, but they were canceled and you're in this legal limbo, right? Because we know that cancellation of removal actually doesn't mean that you immediately get a work permit or that you can go on the path to citizenship, right? So this is just kind of gives you a snapshot view. This is refugee and asylees of the sort of diversity among Central American legal statuses, right? And then, you know, this shows the Civil War migration. And then when you think about the contemporary context, you think about how the enforcement measures that we're seeing now in this anti-immigrant context, the ways in which they're targeting primarily Mexican and Central American immigrants, right? So despite commonalities with other national origin groups, throughout the 1980s, only 3% of Central Americans are granted political asylum, right? And so when we think about what De Genova talks about, the legal production of illegality, this is a direct example, an illustration of how the state has produced illegality among Central American communities, going back to this 1.5% of Central Americans have actually been successful in applying and granted asylum, right? Considering what we know in terms of the context in which they exited, this has been, you know, one of the, you know, the root sources, right, of the kind of illegality that Central Americans have lived. And now, in this enforcement context, Central Americans make up over 20% of deportees, right? So if you see the statistics over the year of the DHS, of Department of Homeland Security, you go down the list of countries of origin, you see Mexico, 500,000, and then you add up Honduras, El Salvador, Nicaragua, and you see that it makes up the bulk of folks being targeted for deportation as well. So now that I've talked a little bit about the structural context, the theoretical kind of framework, I want to sort of bring it back to the ethnography of this talk and this case that I'm doing. This structural context has had a direct impact on the local context. And I'm here representing Los Angeles, so in the Bay Area. So the local context, right? Los Angeles received in the Civil War migration well over the great majority of Central American migrants and refugees. 53% of Hondurans, 59% of Guatemalans, 54% of Salvadorans actually settled in Los Angeles. And you can see the growth in a decade, right, in terms of that Civil War migration. In 1980, there were 30,000 Salvadorans living in LA. By 1990, that population had, skyrocketed to 300,000. In terms of this, the kind of socio-political and legal context that Central Americans encountered in Los Angeles, it was, in many Central American scholars, a gesture to the fact that individuals and communities didn't sort of accept their legal exclusion passively, but that there was tremendous response in the form of immigrant rights mobilizations. And these are just some examples of the institutionalization of that movement, right? El Rescate gets founded in 1981, Carecen in DC in 81, Carecen in LA in 83, Chirda 86. I included the San Francisco just because I knew it was here, so I had to, because I usually don't talk about that, but they definitely were there. 1991 Asocial. My point with this is that, and that's another kind of part of my book, but sort of mapping the ways in which social movements and grassroots organizing gets institutionalized, right? And the whole sort of modus, the reason for existence, I guess, of these organizations were really immigrant rights work. Before 1986, it was grassroots organizing. After 1986 in IRCA, it was brands that founded things like Chirda. So, but with every sort of, these organizations came and really changed the dynamic of the barrios in which Central Americans and Latinos were living in, right? So if you're, familiar with Los Angeles, Pico Union and, West, all that area around there, Adams and all that, Central American community organizations really changed the atmosphere there, right? But with every image that you had of organizing, activism, and immigrant engagement like this, you had 10, 15 images of this, right, of criminalization, images of, criminal activity. In the 1992 civil unrest, you had, hundreds of stories about the other Latinos and the looters, right, which was code words for, those Central Americans, right, that live in Pico Union. So for me, when I was thinking about legality and thinking about the Central American case, I really had to also account for the ways in which the narratives of Central American community members revolved around this experience. The ways in which legality translated into everyday life experience around these kinds of issues, around racialization, racial belonging, etc. So, talking about how, for me, theory was limited, I gravitated toward work in sociology that really worked around the concept of belonging. And this was really helpful to me, right? Because belonging was able not only to include formal rules of membership that are inscribed in the body due to race, gender, class, ethnicity, but rules of membership, that affect people that are top down, right? The concept of belonging involves thinking of the ways in which gender, class, ethnicity, and immigration status intersect to position migrants in unequal and hierarchical relationships in relation to other groups in the local context. And this is Floya Antias's work, Neri Yuval Davis, all these scholars in sociology that do this work. This concept of belonging was something that was really helpful to me in being able to really sort of flesh out, all right, the ways in which legality was translating or expressing itself vis-a-vis the narratives of Central American migrants that I interviewed. And that was really, that's really the intersection of my work, right? Applying theory to actually the lived experiences of folks. So I wanted to use the case of Central Americans to apply this intersectional approach to understanding Latinos' political and social identities, and now how these are constructed in relation to the intersection of legal status, racialization, ethnic identity, cultural difference, and the ways these interact in the local context. So I wanted to just, for those of you, interested in sort of the method of this, I'm going to present to you complex and lengthy narratives. Well, I've shortened them for the presentation. But of 44 migrant activists that I interviewed, the ones I'm presenting are those just based out of Los Angeles, because I did some research in Washington, D.C. as well. And I selected the respondents on the snowball sampling, starting with immigrant organizations in Los Angeles, and I'm going to present to you the experiences of those that were bounded within what we call the Civil War migration, right? And to give you kind of a snapshot of how much the experiences of what Menjivar calls, liminal legality kind of shaped the diverse experiences. Because I interviewed folks that were middle-aged, interviewed folks that were, younger generation, but all of them at some point had tremendous experiences with liminal legality, right? So we had 5 undocumented, 5 asylum. The great majority were beneficiaries of the ABC or the NACADA legislation that passed in 1997, 7 on TPS, and then the LPRs and people that were able to naturalize this to U.S. citizenship. But importantly, out of 44 respondents, a third were in uncertain legal status, right? And these are folks that are activists, right? I mean, so that was really interesting, I think, to see. And in terms of deportability, almost all knew someone that had been deported. 12 had been issued a stay of deportation, so they had been issued deportation, but had fought it or whatever. There were a few that had experienced actual deportation. In fact, one of the folks that I'm going to show you a narrative of had been deported when he was 1 with his mother. And responding to the question of, have you lived in legal limbo for more than a year in the U.S., again, a great majority. Only a few had actually not, at one point, experienced being undocumented. So I guess for me, my approach and my analytical framework for the case really takes the best ideas from Meinai and Dijanova and citizenship theory to kind of provide some organizing frames to the narrative texts of the folks that I interviewed. The key variable here would be status, right? Whether you're, what's your status? Are you undocumented? Are you an asylee? Interacting with experiences of racialization, experiences of belonging, strategies of empowerment, and your notions of citizenship. So what I'm going to present to you today are excerpts from these themes, right? So for instance, you can't really understand how people experience their legal status without understanding how that interacts with their experiences of racialization in Los Angeles, in the urban context. And that, one of the key sort of recurring themes was the idea of being invisible on the one hand and being hypervisible on the other. So it was really interesting because people really talked about citizenship in much more nuanced ways, right, than just rights. You know, it was for them a question of being hypervisible or being completely invisible, shaped by their positioning across these intersections. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about belonging, right? So this idea that your status, your experience with illegality has shaped these feelings of being permanently impermanent, despite your change in status, right? So this category speaks a little bit to the emotional and psychological dimensions of Central Americans' experiences. And then I'm going to end with talking a little bit about how this status also interacts with the kinds of strategies that people develop to confront these kinds of exclusions. So let me start a little bit, and I think I'll flesh these categories out a little bit with the actual examples. So I want to start with this idea of hypervisibility, right? Because this is something that's really common throughout the narratives of these activists. This is someone who was in asylum, was in asylum processes at the time of the interview, right? In school, he says, I used to get beat up almost every day. People made fun of me because I used vos instead of tú, and gaseosa instead of soda. I had all these different ways of talking from El Salvador. I knew they didn't like me because I was Salvadoran. When we moved further west, I started hanging out with la madre, right? And so his story goes on, and this is in response to a question about asylum, right? So you would expect to kind of hear, well, I've been fighting this case, and my lawyer says this, and my lawyer says that. But his response was really sort of nuanced with, experiences that he remembered of arriving to Los Angeles young and having these experiences, right, in which his cultural difference within these spaces really is what structured his feelings of belonging. Nonetheless, right, legal status, and this is what I say in the paper, that legal status kind of forms the context and the backdrop, right, of these experiences, because Central Americans were constructed as an undocumented and illegal and deportable population, right, during this time. So this is another person who I titled this excerpt, Salvi Superheroes, right? There weren't any Salvi superheroes, and I don't know what they would look like even if there were, right? That would be an interesting paper to itself. Or pop cultural icons to shine a light on the Salvi self-awareness path. But my mom used to always warn me, say you're Mexican, that you were born here, right? Still I yearn for another multi-purpose, self-identifying term. I wanted something a little more specific than Latinos to say that I'm actually a little more Salvi than anything else. I wanted a title not so much so others could recognize me, but so I could recognize myself. And so this kind of sense of hypervisibility, right, is countered by the sense of invisibility, right? And in a way, this invisibility was so interesting because it was an outcome of legal status, but it was also a strategy to confront it, right? So pass, say you're Mexican, right? Pass as Mexican. And this is something that was a recurring theme throughout many, many, many narratives, right? The use of Mexican, the term Mexican as a signifier in terms of how Salvadorans and Central Americans more generally constructed their ideas of belonging and membership. The second theme that I wanted to talk a little bit about is this idea of impermanence, right? Going back to the to the slide where one of the key themes was this sense of truncated membership, right? And this is the emotional and psychological effects of illegality, even on folks that had adjusted their status. So this is, at the time, this was a TPS beneficiary, and she had been on TPS, I think 11 years at the time of the interview. She was also very active, right? Even though she had temporary protected status, she had formed and founded her community-based organization. She says, I don't think because I have TPS and I'm permanent here, just because I've lived here 23 years and raised a family, I don't think I'm American. Residency won't change much. What will it change? Maybe a better job. Every day gets more vulnerable for our people. So this you would expect this kind of ambivalence, right, about belonging in the US when you're only temporarily protected, even though you have other forms of community membership. And there's a lot of studies that kind of talk about that, right? This idea of I'm not here nor there, etc. But I think when this kind of experience is contrasted with someone who, and this is a bad picture, but someone who's become a citizen, right? So this is another person who had actually become a citizen, even though she had experienced many years on and off of legal uncertainty. And she reflects the kind of same themes, right? So I call this permanent impermanence because it goes beyond legal status to extend into a sort of a lived experience, right? She says, when I got my green card, I took it everywhere. And then when I applied to citizenship, I had to give up my green card, and I said, wait, how are they gonna know that I'm legal? Finally, I got my passport. I carry my passport everywhere I go. And she takes it out and shows it to me in the middle of the interview, right? So much so that the last one was so damaged. My boyfriend, again, the signifier Mexican, my boyfriend who's Mexican doesn't understand that. You know, it's psychological in a lot of ways because you feel if you don't have that paper and you pass through immigration, they're gonna say, there's an error. They're gonna take your passport. I'm always feeling like something bad is gonna happen. And some of my colleagues, there's one of my colleagues here sitting here, we use the term Central American paranoia, and a lot of times as a way to sort of, use humor to diffuse the kinds of very traumatic experiences that as researchers and as Central Americans ourselves, we've come to kind of know as a very sort of part and parcel of our own experience. But the last couple slides that I want to present to you is that these weren't the only themes that I saw in the narratives. Sure, there were narratives about permanent impermanence, about struggling with invisibility and hypervisibility, but there were also plenty of narratives about people's experiences with participation. Participation in their communities, participation in organizations, participation through hometown associations, right? These were all things. But the ways in which they were connected and conditioned by these experiences of exclusion were actually very compelling, right? And it led me to kind of further examine how or what participation meant to these folks who had lived in periods of uncertain legal status, right? And so my last couple slides are going to be unpacking a little bit of that. So, like I said, many of these folks that were involved in the refugee rights and immigrant rights movements of Central Americans had never had formal means of political participation. Many of them had been, excluded in their countries of origin because they were in democratic regimes, right? But nonetheless, many of them had experiences of political organizing prior to migrating, right? Teachers unions, comunidades de base, student groups, etc., right? So it's kind of interesting to think about these folks fled civil wars and political persecution, but yet really, and come to the US in the face of different kind of violence, right? A different kind of legal violence. Even though these themes of violence extend and are qualitatively different across borders, right? Many of them use participation as forms of self-defense, right? So for instance, talking to folks in El Salvador, talking to folks, in Nicaragua, talking to folks in Guatemala who said, well, if I didn't participate, then I would be even more vulnerable, right? If people didn't know, because I wasn't active in this particular organization and the Red Cross didn't know that my husband had disappeared, I would have just been one of a million people, right? So participation becomes a really interesting, form of protection in both of these contexts. And that's kind of what I want to talk about a little bit. So, in the context of deportability and dislocation, participation in these narratives become a strategy of survival, a form of visibility, and an identity formation, right? A way to claim identity. And this is kind of an example of how I'm interpreting this. Freddie's also a TPS beneficiary. like many other folks on TPS that I interviewed, he had been in the United States for years, right? And had been active in the community despite his uncertain legal status. He says, it is ironic, if you talk about citizenship and the way American society perceives it, I think I do my part. I consider myself more educated as to how the American system works than any other American citizen, and maybe more than their ancestors, who came over here with the Mayflower, because you have to for survival. And so this was really interesting, right? Because you think of citizenship as something that is the ultimate kind of symbol, especially for an immigrant, right? Of you made it, right? You made it. You're an immigrant. You're part of, the immigrant, narrative of America. But in these narratives, what I was finding was that participating and becoming a citizen was a mechanism of self-defense, right? A mechanism of survival, right? And this really wouldn't make sense outside of the context of deportability. And then for those, because this is an illustration of a TPS beneficiary, for those who had actually, in my sample, who had actually attained naturalization, right, citizenship wasn't the end all, right, but it was the minimum threshold that you needed to really substantiate your political membership. And this is what I mean, right? Citizenship, it's a limited freedom. You still have to work to participate, to improve things here and there. And when I say there, he was referring to his country of origin, Guatemala, right? This is Sandra, who we met earlier. I feel more secure than before, and now I can do more things to be a citizen, here and also in El Salvador. So there's this common theme of, once acquiring citizenship, you would hypothesize, right, that you would have a sense of like, now I'm a mayor, now I'm belonging, now I'm a member, and now I can just sit back, kick my heels up, and just chill, right? But instead, you had these narratives of limited freedom. Now that I have citizenship, now I can really go out and do something, right? So it was really kind of a reinterpretation of what citizenship meant. So I'm going to end with a thought on this about the paradox of theorizing about legality and citizenship, right? That after decades in this community of struggling for legalization, Central American activists that I talked to articulate a much more expansive notion of citizenship, right? As extending beyond legal status, right? And that's what's really interesting. It's talking about citizenship as visibility, as protection against forms of social and legal violence, and as forms of collective obligation, right? So very different from this kind of individualistic idea of citizenship. And after decades of fighting for rights of citizenship, it becomes a minimal threshold to begin to take on the obligations of citizenship, right? So I think that in thinking about the ways in which the case can actually contribute theoretically to our understandings not only of legality but of Latino identity and political behavior, it really requires an analysis of legal status and its relationship to citizenship, requires an understanding of citizenship beyond legal status, number one, and legal status as extending into everyday life and as a form of lived experience. But also, it has to take into account forms of racialization and racial belonging. It has to take into account other forms of community membership, and I said this already, but forms of everyday life. So even though the case is very unique, because I am looking at Civil War migrations, it can be very generative for other immigrant cases, because as we see with the undocumented youth and Obama's strategy, we're now again talking about temporary protected status or deferred action, right? For another group of, that's going to affect 200,000 people, but we still don't know whether that's going to really translate into an earned path to citizenship. And as we see with the Central American case, TPS was first granted in 1990, right? It's 2012, and we still, to this day, have not resolved the issue of status for Central Americans. So even though the case is very unique, I think it's generative. And then theories of racialization also, which we're starting to really, I think that over the last decade, we've started to really see studies of Latino racialization in a very serious way, should actually also account more rigorously for the effects of legal status. So it's not, I think, sufficient to say all Latinos are racialized in the context of the United States, and all Latinos are going to be thought of as permanent foreigners. We really have to take into account differences amongst Latino groups and the difference that legal status, but not only that, legality has made in their identity, in their political and social identity formation. So with that, I'll end. Thank you. Okay, I'm like, I don't know what's next. Yeah.
So I'm going to go ahead and open it up for questions and answers. And I will answer it. Open it up for questions. So go ahead, we'll just open up the floor. Yes, in the back.
Oh, thank you very much for a really fascinating talk. I was just trying to relate, this is somewhat of a half-formed thought, but in terms of parsing what happened in this election and the kind of suppression of votes, it seems as though a lot of people are experiencing, I don't know what you want to call it, liminal legality, even though they're supposedly citizens, and that in some ways I think the injection of all of this kind of super PAC money has engendered actually a fair amount of activism, which is actually good in terms of this notion of participation, really actively claiming the vote. Sometimes it's by organizing and standing in line for hours. I mean, to me, it was striking that people were really claiming their right to vote. And so it's kind of like, I'm just wondering whether people who are in this situation of having their citizenship kind of threatened, are more likely to have formed this more active notion of citizenship, which in some ways I think is very beneficial.
I think that's such an interesting question. You know what it makes me think of, because I was telling Veronica earlier that I tend to answer questions in narrative form, so I'm a storyteller. So I'll answer your question with something it reminds me of, and that was one of the respondents in my sample talked, who was TPS, so she couldn't actually vote, and she talked extensively about her experiences mobilizing in local campaigns, right? So doing the door-to-door canvassing and working for different mayors, and her experience of participation. And I remember asking her, they don't see that, she said, that we exercise the vote. We may not vote, but we exercise it. So she kept sort of gesturing to this term of activity, right? Not just being granted a right and using it, but actually, kind of deconstructing what voting really is, right? Because many of us political scientists quantify the act of casting your ballot, but we don't really give you a picture of how you made up your decisions. You were talking with your family. Hey, what are you gonna do on 30? Hey, what do you think of this 37 genetically modified food? So we have these kind of conversations, and before we even go into the booth, right? We have formed our political identity, right? And so political scientists are really good at telling you the correlation between you casting that ballot, but we don't do such a great job of telling you how you came to think of yourself as a rights-bearing person, right? Because I think that's really key in sort of, accounting for that. So I think you're absolutely right in seeing folks, because, is it a rational thing to stand 4 hours in line, somewhere where you're not even sure that vote is in the aggregate's really going to count? But if you connect with the meaning and the symbolic nature of what that means to that person, then you can account for that story. But you can't do it in sort of a rationalistic way that has been the model of political science for a really long time.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, one thing to this election was this reactionary anti-immigrant minority was essentially lost the election. If you look at the polls of the whole population, the majority of people are pro-immigrant. They do want to, even larger number, want to see, out of fairness, everyone be legal, to rationalize legal status. For instance, so this overwhelmingly people support the Green Act, for instance, is the way to do this. So there's this larger but relatively silent support for normalization of this situation. So, but there's such a active vocal minority. how does this play out? The fact that the political scene exists in this way.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. I was having a conversation with a Republican. Not to say that, you know, I was having a conversation with a Republican. It's really true. He was a moderate Republican, you know. Actually, he's in my family. The truth comes out. But, you know, I was having a conversation on election night, and it was really weird watching the election with a Republican, but we were watching it together. And I said to him, you know, I said, you know, your party really needs, it's going to have to, you know, there's a lot of conversation about what the party's going to do, right? And but really he's a centrist, essentially. He's a centrist, and there's certain things about government intrusion, et cetera, that makes him ideologically more similar to Republican. But this idea that there's a disconnect, especially when, you know, candidates run for national office, and there's a, you know, because of the base of what's driving the Republican Party and the ideological kind of dogmatism that drives the Republican Party, that's really alienating a lot of sort of moderate centrists, right? And so, not to say that this is only a phenomenon of the Republican Party, but I think it just speaks to your issue that that I think immigrant rights mobilizers, like Central Americans, in the case of Central Americans, coalition building was really important, right? Coalition building with progressive Anglos and others has always been a key dimension of Central American, and I would even say undocumented youth activism, right? So the idea that, and I think Central Americans specifically, because Central Americans are sort of used, their identity kind of revolves around, you know, being a minority within a minority, and really not being able to accomplish anything without allies, right? So I think that's been one of the sort of you know, central characteristics of the immigrant rights movement as seen through the lens of Central Americans, right? Coalition building with like-minded allies. Yeah.
Thank you for the talk, very interesting. Maybe because I have a short time here, I know about the activism for part of the Central American, and, you know, but I never saw the phenomenon of this practically, some people say aggressive participation of the Latinos. And I wonder if you find in your research some interconnection with the movement of Occupy and the, you know, and of course they have to be with the really aggressive politic against Latinos, you know, with deportation. But I think it's this Occupy movement opened the door more for another form of counter-aggressive participation in the way of the Latino. I don't know.
Right. No, that's an interesting point. I think two things your question makes me think of. One is that, you know, when my research really focuses on you know, the 80s and 90s political activism in Central Americans, but when I think, no, it's fine. But when I think about Occupy, I think of direct action and civil disobedience, right? That as sort of a pillar, a foundational pillar of counter-hegemonic movements, right? Whether it's the student movement mobilizations in Mexico, whether it's, you know, the Central American, you know, labor and student and union movements in Central America and across borders. Or Spain. Yeah, absolutely, right? Direct action, civil disobedience. So, so for me, it's really interesting because in the context of social movement analysis, a lot of social movement theorists are saying that social movements are dead in the United States, that we really don't see social movements, right? And this is true. I mean, if you look at, you know, the main scholars, social movements, I see it already over there. But if you know, really, I mean, you know, social scholars are really saying that social movements, in the way that they quantify this, they're on the decline, right? And so that's a really interesting thing, because it's so funny that I see Roberto here, because I don't want to put you on the spot, but we had a conversation. He's an activist and part of this generation, right? And we had a conversation about the Occupy movement and how, you know, a lot of, you know, I would call them ninja organizers, Central Americans, because Central Americans are part of everything. Nobody knows that they're there, or that they're Central American, or that their stories surface as Central American, right? And so I remember having a conversation with Roberto about when he, you know, I was doing some research on new media activism, and he was like, look, a lot of, and I hope I can share this, but he was saying that a lot of sort of strategies of the Occupy movement, right, he learned directly from his Central American roots. And I think I see people in the room here, labor activists, my colleague here, Suyaba, as well, right? She talks about how her work with labor movement in Los Angeles was directly rooted to the kinds of political experiences that she had as an Honduran and as a Central American. So these are, for me, I guess the challenge for me is to surface, to be very specific about these stories and these narratives and connecting them to other, because connecting them to other forms of social movement activism, right? And so we can, I think, get going on we can talk a lot about Occupy and how Occupy, because I think one of the key things about Central American activism has been having a base, right? If you talk to a community organizer, they're going to talk about base building, right? That is one thing to use Facebook and send a message out and change your profile, right? And that's kind of like I did my activism for the day. But a lot of Central Americanos are rooted in the practice of base building, right? And so I think a lot of people have critiqued the Occupy movement for the disconnect from a lack of an analysis of race politics, but also the question of base building. But I can't say that speak to that too much because I'm not really fully engaged with the Occupy movement. But those are kind of some of the ideas.
It's not that I'm asking exactly directly to the
Yeah.
Occupy movement, but it's the consequences of this Occupy
Yeah.
that opened the door for
I see what you're saying.
unthinkable
In unthinkable
Americans,
ways. Yeah.
recontested the government in such a
Absolutely.
way, or many governments in
Absolutely.
the world. It's in a space that is open, and suddenly
Yeah.
you hear that comment that you say.
Yeah.
Central Americans say like, I'm not going to vote
That's
because
right.
I'm illegal, but I am working and
Yeah.
I'm going to help to raise the voice of
Absolutely.
Latino.
Absolutely. No, that's a great comment. Thank you.
We have a few questions here. I'm checking, I'm making sure we'll go around, so go ahead and
Thank you, great talk, super interesting. I have a question. Your study is of activists, and I'm interested in what distinguishes these people from other people who don't get politically involved. Because it seems like you're making an argument about their experience in this country is what's driving them towards their activism, how they understand their experiences of racialization, of belonging, or whatever. But then what explains the fact that some people don't get engaged? Like, how do you distinguish the activists from the non-activists who are having similar experiences?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I think firstly, you're right. This study was based on activists, right? Folks that actually. So I oversampled for the activists, right? So I think anything I say will be anecdotal in nature, but one that I think. If I had more funding for this project, one of the things that we were working with some students in is looking at the other side of transnational participation. So one of my chapters, and so I'll give you a sense of how I try to address this in the book. One of the key differences that I saw was gender, right? The gendered aspects of political participation in the Central American community was striking, right? When you start to see how much gender plays a role in limiting the structural opportunities for participation, even given the sort of grassroots associational nature of these groups. It's not like we're talking about a lot of these folks are not paid staff members, right? But when you look at, let's say you look at the sample of 70 people that are interviewed in DC and LA, you start to see the differences of those that were actually able to become staff members, right? Mostly men, mostly folks that had some level of education in their countries of origin, mostly people that had experiences of political participation in their countries of origin that carried over, right, to Los Angeles. So there were actually very few instances So let me give you two examples. I think this is really interesting. So let me answer this by saying, on the one hand, you definitely see a difference in opportunity structures, right, for given race, class, gender, etc. amongst this population that I think you would probably expect. On the other hand, right, on these in this table here, I don't know where it was, but here, okay. But on the other hand, I did have folks in these categories, right, TPS, and even undocumented folks, that became very active in the community. And their stories were, well, I came, and I remember, you know, this one narrative really easy. I came to Carecen for legal advice and legal services, right? And I started coming, and next thing you know, I was in a charla, right? And that charla, I started, you know, and then I realized that the president and this particular group had been the president for 8 years. And I was like, this is a democracy, why is this drunk guy the president? And this was her story. She kept saying that this guy would get drunk and come to meetings. And so her political sort of consciousness started to form around, so I would say, I think we should, in studying this phenomenon more closely, we should obviously pay attention to the structural variables that limit opportunities. We should also pay attention to these what Lisa calls mobilizing structures. How are these organizations and these institutions, right, facilitating participation for those that wouldn't normally be active? And I think what's happened in this particular community is that at one point they were based on a much broader sense of participation, and it was because they were involved in social movement activism or social movement work. Once these organizations became more institutionalized and kind of a service organizations, right? That participation and those opportunities that people got to have stories like that. I came to legal service, and the next thing you know, I was in a charter, right? They're not doing as an effective job anymore, right? To facilitate a more broader base of participation.
We had a question back here, and then we'll move around the room.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about the collective struggles that are going on, and whether or not the activists that you spoke to all had, whether there were common visions of what was being struggled for, not just what it would mean for them personally, but what they thought their sort of collective struggles or movements were searching for. And I'm also curious how the activists you talked to understood their relationship to other sort of segments of immigrant rights struggles. Obviously, LA is the epicenter of this movement. So what was the interaction like?
That's a very good question. I would say two things. On the one hand, if I understand your question correctly, are the vision of these activists that I interviewed, are their visions of social change and social transformation, do they map onto each other pretty easily? And I would say yes and no. I would say yes in the sense that, you know, obviously when you are positioned in a certain way vis-a-vis immigration law and other social structures, class, you know, race, etc., that a lot of the stories that you tell about your vision of social change will be similar. But one of the key things that I think, going back to gender, gender was, you know, a key variable, I thought, even more so than class in this particular community, that I saw a divergence in terms of that vision. So in my other chapter, which I probably maybe should have presented to this, but in my other chapter, I talk about how Central American women tended to focus on social issues, youth, education, and mental health and trauma, right? Much more than Central American men did. Men were much more interested in interethnic rivalry, even in the context of immigrant rights, right? So even within the context of immigrant rights,
considering when you're dealing with Salvadoreños, not these Salvador-centric. You're dealing with a population that's highly political, as reflected, for example, in the fact that during the war, according to the Universidad Centroamericana, 1 in every 3 of Salvadoreños had adopted quote-unquote radicalized politics. Revolutionary, not just radical occupied, revolutionary linked to political military organizations. So you're talking about a very different sensibility of the political. Then the question, empire and citizenship, right? Right now, citizenship is being defined by the decline of empire versus, say, white and black citizenship and movement up was at a time when industrialism and U.S. empire, post-World War II were. So what effect does the decline of this empire have on Central American, for maybe projecting out, what effect does it have on the kind of future identity of this political community?
The decline of empire.
Yes.
Well, that's not a hard question at all. It reminds me of qualifying exams. No, I think it's a. No, I think it's a good. I think it's an incredibly important question. You know, it's really interesting to think about. It's so interesting that you talk about empire, because as I was thinking about my book proposal and how I'm approaching it, I thought that one of the key things about studies of Central Americans is that it's usually sort of presented in a way that says, well, Central Americans came to the U.S. and they were denied legal status, and so there's this undocumented population. But it's never really rooted in the context of the way in which Central America, the neo-colonial relationship the United States has had with Central America. And that's really interesting because I'm right now teaching social movements, right? And we look at Chicano activism, we look at Puerto Rican activism, and a lot of the intellectual work around these communities has in fact been rooted in empire, and studying empire and coloniality, right? Whereas for some reason Central Americans, and I think we're going to be adding and contributing to that discussion, right? But the relationship, the U.S. relationship to Central America, is something that's either not touched on or not unpacked in scholarship. I'm saying, obviously amongst us it is, but I think it's a really crucial thing to understand U.S. policy towards the region, not just U.S. policy, but empire in the region, as intimately shaping this kind of identity. So it's not just about being a minority within a minority in this kind of frame of race and ethnicity within the U.S. It has to be hemispheric and transnational in nature. It has to account for what you're saying, right? How political identity was shaped in countries of origin, and in this experience of empire especially over the 500 years, but especially in the 20th century. So I'm not sure I can give you an intelligent answer in terms of citizenship, because I think you're absolutely right. I think it's really, I'm calling my book project Contesting Citizenship, right? And I think that even still sounds a little bit too liberalism oriented, right? A rights-based framework. And I'm just not sure it's working for me anymore, to be honest with you. So after this conversation, I'm moving more and more towards post-colonial and subaltern studies, right, as a way to understand this experience, And, I called it citizenship because I was in political theory at UCLA, so I had to call it something that allowed me, right, to talk about this experience. But I think for me, it's like I'm navigating more and more towards that paradigm and that framework. And if you want to, respond or add anything, I'd be happy to hear your thoughts.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. I really enjoyed hearing you speak. I wanted to make a comment and then also ask you a question about your future research, but I hope. So I just really had a visceral reaction to Occupy. Can I just say something? And part of it is because as a historian, there is no, it's a historical to say that Occupy opened space for Central Americans, as Lovato was saying here, right? Like, the important thing about these Central Americans is that they came with knowledge. The entire leadership of the URNG lived in San Francisco during the war, right? They flew to Guatemala to negotiate peace in 1992, is that true? Right? So this is a really, I really love your, I have to add this to the ninja organizers. It's perfect, because that's how the Communist Party organized in Latin America and Central America, right? So in some ways, like, Occupy didn't open any doors, they're organizing open doors. So one example is the multi-immigrant, what is it? Multi-immigrant
Workers
organizing network. That was started by Central Americans, ninja organizers. Nobody knows this, but it was started by Central Americans to designate May 1st as Immigrant Worker Day. And now we all over the nation march that day for immigrant workers. And that was started by Central Americans organizing day laborers, in 1998, 1999. So, do you see what I'm saying? That's historical right there. That's really like, and so that's what I have to say about this Occupy could take some lessons, I think, from some historical movement, particularly in LA. But I really, really love this ninja I think you should do something with that.
Yeah. My next article.
And I really, really want to ask you more about the diaspora, like these young people that you're working with,
Yeah.
undocumented youth. Like, I don't know if you can talk a little bit about where you're going with that. How do you see 2000 and beyond and now? Like, how do you envision in the context of all of this historically?
Yeah, I mean, I think you gave you and then Roberto and the folks here that have been involved directly in organizing. I'm more and more, because I'm been writing a lot of research statements for grant proposals lately. And whenever you write research statements, like, okay, I did this for my dissertation and I'm doing this now, and how do those things connect? And you confuse yourself sometimes. But I think you're making it rather clear, to be honest with you. I mean, I think that there's an organic connection with linking Central American activism around immigrant rights, because that's not something we ever hear, to be quite honest with you. There's been an extensive number of scholarship on labor organizing in Los Angeles with Central Americans given some type of tangential agency, but we haven't really seen the immigrant rights movement framed around the theme of Central American activism. And when I was doing my ethnographic research, I found that this actually permeates Suyapa in other ways. I was doing research in Washington, D.C., I was doing field work, and I remember going to Casa de Maryland to do ethnographic work. And I thought to myself, well, Casa, that's a Central American organization. You know, I'm going to go over there, I'm going to talk to people, they're going to receive me with open arms. And that wasn't the case, because as soon as I said, hey, I'm doing my dissertation work on Central American activism, they were like, well, I don't know, this isn't really Central American, or this is an immigrants' rights organization. And I said, no, but I mean, I know that you Casa, you initiated this with Quakers and with religious activists and so there was a reluctance, right, to frame themselves as a Central American organization, similar with Chirla in Los Angeles, right? So for some reason, I mean, this is really a political problem, right? The fact that for some reason, I mean, we can joke about the ninja thing, but this sort of silencing that I talked about with invisibility also translates to organizations. Like, why is there a reluctance to name it, right? A Central American organization, or one that was rooted in Central American struggle. And I'm not sure, I haven't fully answered that. I know that my own ethnographic experiences are anecdotal, but they speak to kind of a larger, I think, problem, right? Of the reason why this history has been obfuscated by the very people that work at these organizations.
I'm going to come back to you, Kevin. I just want to make sure I don't ignore this side of the room either. I know you had your hand up.
Thank you so much for the presentation. I really appreciate how intersectional and all the different issues that you're doing with like mental health, organizing, racialization, and so on and so forth.
Good, I'm glad, because my dissertation chair really didn't appreciate it.
I was about to say, I'm sure it was tough to get it approved, but you had to break a lot of rules to make it happen. So my question was this, and it's something that I'm dealing with within my family as well. So my question is in terms of like the inner voice within activist spaces, that what allows them to say, I want to be more present, I want to be more outspoken, or I need to step aside, or
Step up or step back?
Yeah, something like that. Because the example you said about the woman who used to have a green card and now has a passport, that's my mom. That's my mom. After 13 years, she finally had her residency, and now that she's fighting for her citizenship. When I asked her what about jobs? Are you excited about jobs and job opportunities? Now she's like, no, because I'm not a citizen yet. I'm like, well, what about this whole now access that you have because now you're a resident? Why aren't we excited about that right now? She's like, well, because I'm not a citizen yet. And I'm like, whoa, wait a minute now, 13 years we were struggling to get this. Let's go see what's out there for us right now, and then, we'll figure it out. And she doesn't want to because she doesn't see herself still as having the full access. So that's my mom's experience there. And
So interesting.
I work with a lot of first generation college students, and me being a first generation college student, I went through those access stages. First, dealing with do I belong academically here?
Yeah.
Can I be outspoken? Going through those accesses. So my question is, what are those levels of access in the activist spaces? Because they're so multi-generational, right? Some folks have citizenship, some folks have residency, some folks don't, and there's so much hybridity there that I'm wondering, on top of the gender, on top of like the mailing, what does that come into play? And this is all first draft thinking, so I'm sorry, I'm not.
No, it's really interesting. I'm actually thinking of two things when you ask me that question. One is I find thank you for your story. I think it's really, really interesting because I've been doing a lot of work with undocumented youth in DACA, right? The deferred action. We've been doing a lot of interviews around folks that are reluctant to apply and will apply, right? Will apply, but yet are dealing with the emotional fallout of being invisible and learning strategies in the shadow of the law and of the state. And you learn strategies to deal with it, right? You take public transportation, you have a friend drive you around when you need it. I mean, there's everyday life strategies that being undocumented forces you to take on. But once an opportunity for documentation happens, it's not just about applying and proving your residency, it's the emotional and psychological trauma that you've been faced with and having to deal with a complete change, right? Of all of a sudden becoming visible to the state. So I don't think that your mom's reaction to her status, it's really an identity shift. Right? Why that's different. And then in terms of within the activist community, how different is, and this is a good question that I might have to flesh out even more forcefully in my own work, was how does legal status shift not only the structure of opportunity, but your identity as an activist? And I can answer that, just off the top of my head, looking at the folks that actually become staff members and become paid staff members, right? Legal status prevents you from getting paid, right? You might be a consultant, right? And so I found that legal status, especially around day laborers that I interviewed, as opposed to folks that came before 1981, that were students, that had a certain, that even though we're refugees, were folks that were able to get into the pipeline, adjusted their status in 86, became citizens in 95, right? And so there's a clear, a divergence of experiences shaped around legal status, even within the activist community. Even though they all may say, we all had levels of, feeling uncertain in our lives, clearly some were able to make a career out of immigrant organizing, right? And some were not. And this falls around both gender and legal status as the two key variables, because many of the women that were founders of these organizations were not able to make careers out of their activism like the men did, right? And so a lot of these folks are called, the dinosaurs of the community now, because they've been there for so long, right? I would say that that's the way that, and then in terms of your question about youth, I have somebody here who's a member of USAIL, which is,
5 or 6.
Oh, sorry, a 5 or 6. And one of the things that I've been talking to some of the USAIL members in LA about is that this transnational identity that forms around USAIL, right? I think I had an image in another talk that I gave of the USAIL symbol, right? Which is actually it's a group that's formed here. Well, it really didn't form in Central America, but it's El Salvador, right? That's the symbol. And I was thinking about folks that I've talked to that are of Salvadoran origin, that are undocumented youth, that are working in undocumented youth organizations. And I thought, well, why don't you work with USAIL, right? Well, it's like, they do trips abroad and I can't travel abroad, right? So it was something that we talked about last time. It's like, how interesting that citizenship is the threshold and the basis of developing a transnational identity, right? That's really that citizenship is not, juxtaposed to transnationalism. It's actually the very minimal thing that you have to have. Because I talk to undocumented youth of Central American origin all the time, and they don't identify as Central American because legal status is the preeminent political and social identity, but 2, they have never been able to travel the ways in which I did when I was really young.
We're going to take 2 more questions, Kevin, and we'll take yours, and then we can continue having it over food. So we'll just do these last 2 questions, and then we'll move over to the reception.
I really enjoyed the talk, and thank you very much. My question is, so I know you talked about intersectionality, you said Bosnia, and you talked about like the Geneva and A9 and race and undocumented status and illegality. And I've done work with undocumented youth, and a lot of times they emphasize different aspects of their identity strategically, right? So kind of queer and undocumented, or queer and undocumented women of color from immigrant family. And so kind of like these multiple identities that we hold really do shape the ways that we kind of see ourselves as activists, as organizers, as youth, as people mobilizing. And so I guess I wanted to ask if we could talk a little bit more about this idea of intersectionality in relation to citizenship, because a lot of times citizenship is discussed as like a framework that is the master frame, the end status, the one that will kind of fix a lot of different things. And as discussion has shown and as your presentation talks about, that having citizenship doesn't really mean an end all, you know, we're fine, we're happy. And legal status and engagement with the law is kind of like a one-way, kind of moving towards something, not moving backwards, and kind of there's multiple ways in which people engage with the law. And so I guess I'm kind of curious as to how you see intersectionality being practiced or experienced by people in which you talk to and kind of work with the activists and the organizing.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's funny because when you say citizenship as the master narrative, I mean, I was at fault for that early on in my graduate career. I was like, citizenship, like I walked around with a, you know, poster, citizenship, like that was my thing. I studied it through legal theory, through sociology, and now I'm at that point in my career where, you know, as I showed you at the end of the presentation, right, that citizenship, that citizenship is almost something that, that is, like I said, the minimal threshold, right? It isn't the end all, right? It's the beginning. It's the beginning of being able to counter the kind of trauma that's been experienced because of legal uncertainty, right? And that's, you know, so citizenship as just one piece, right, of the broader context, like you said, of the ways in which you engage with the law. But I think in terms of your question, I want to sort of respond to it in a way that does justice to it, and I'm curious if you are coming from the perspective of like the undocumented youth movement and how they position themselves vis-a-vis citizenship, or how, the differences that that sexuality and gender make even within the context of being undocumented. So I just wanted to kind of bounce that back, because I wasn't sure if I understood the question.
I guess my question is kind of just looking at social movements around immigration and citizenship status, whether it be undocumented youth or adults, Central American, or other, you know, organizing spaces, how intersectionality functions, or narratives around intersectionality and multiple identities. And is that strategic? Is that something that people are consciously doing? Is that something that is very important? I know you talked about like gender and women's role and gender identity in relation to like organizing spaces with women taking a leadership position. So like, do they really discuss being a woman and being an immigrant is very important to the intervention they're making in that space. So like, how are those intersectionalities being talked about and discussed in those spaces? Right.
Well, you know, I mean, to answer your question, I mean, when it's so funny because you said you talk about this, you talk about that. There's a lot of stuff I talk about, right? But the thing is, like, you know, it's funny because intersectionality was seen as a paradigm, you know, 20 or so years ago that was something that was going to be useful for scholars to address questions of citizenship, social equality, etc. In the Central American community, you know, vis-a-vis the Central American community, I sometimes get overwhelmed, you know, myself by intersectionality, right? Because without that framework, you're lost, right? Because like I said, race, ethnicity, or class, gender, sexuality are axes that intersect even within categories like national origin, right? So it's something that you can't just presume a priori that I call it, and I'm not calling it Central American without being self-reflexive of how that very term, right, masks the inequalities across these categories. Right? So that's something that I'm very aware of, and with my Honduran colleague here, I'm very aware of creating other hegemonic notions of identity by even using the term Central American. Right? So I think for activists in some spaces, there's more self-reflexivity about naming than in other spaces. Right? And I would say amongst this particular case, self-reflexivity is something that is used, that has to be used even before you get into organizing. Why? Because you look at this table, and a lot of my ethnographic and participant observation happen at tables like this. You had a Mayan Guatemalan, a Garifuna Honduran, an Honduran, you know, a LGBT. I mean, it was such, you know, multiculturalism was part and parcel and central to even beginning to make alliances across groups, right? So there was always having to be a self-reflexivity about identity categories even within the group. I don't know, we can talk a little bit more, because I know people are, they said pupusas and people are,
I know.
people are unfocused. And I think I've been talking too long, so.
We'll just do one last question, and then we'll head over.
I feel I lost the room when the pupusas were mentioned.
I know, we'll head over. Go ahead.
I'm a resident of El Salvador, even though I'm okay, but I was there for the 15 years after the Civil War.
Wow.
So almost got my citizenship. So I want some pieces. I'm actually, this might be a long question, if it is, we can time it another time, but I'm interested in the school intersection with the social institutions like schools, this is how research focuses on.
Yeah.
And how that plays into the political participation in citizenship. I know
Yeah.
High school is a key time because citizenship matters a lot more once you become 18, you have these legal rights.
Very much so, yeah.
But I find in my research that what the school context does, what the school environment does, can very much push the students into becoming politically engaged.
No doubt about it.
So and I know it's a different context. I mean, I know in the context of some of these people that are older, when you're talking to them now, came at a time that schools probably were playing different roles. In either supporting that or subtracting, as Don Slava says, subtracting the resources and kind of invisibilizing them even more. So I'm just curious how
That's
that.
a great question. And you know, if I had the wherewithal to do another PhD, I would do it in education. because honestly, all my work around citizenship eventually meets at the crossroads of the role that education plays in fostering political participation. In both the case studies I'm working on, the Central American case, it wasn't something that I looked at specifically, but it's definitely something that, tangentially I remember in the work comes up, because I wasn't in my interview protocol, I wasn't even asking about that, right? But I've been doing research over the last 2 years on undocumented youth activism. And one of the key variables, the contextual variables that fosters political participation is whether youth in their high schools or in their college experiences had ethnic studies, access to ethnic studies. That's been a key variable amongst dreamers, regardless of socioeconomic background, et cetera, et cetera. So that's just something that I can tell you off the top of my head. And in terms of the Central American youth, one of the key things that the community organizations had to do, and I'm sorry, I didn't get your name. Kristen, one of the things that the organizations that I studied, a lot of what they did, and a lot of the activists that I talked about, and I have interviews with some of these folks, was at the time institute parallel or alternative civic education programs. Mm-hmm. And these civic education programs emphasize different narratives of Central American identity, right, than the ones that these youth were being exposed to. And then obviously Roberto and other folks were involved in instituting the Central American Studies program at CSUN. But it was really interesting because these community organizations and these communities were kind of doing the work that schools at the time weren't able to. And in fact, it was kind of a dichotomous experience where a lot of these youth would go to school and would not see themselves, and in fact would have to pass. But then, because of these community organizations and their contact with these organizations, their identity formation became one that would be latently activated later in life. So for instance, we have like Epicentro America, which is a poetry group, a poetry collective, and one thing that characterizes the poets across, all of them eventually went on to higher education degrees and then beyond. But they were all like sort of Pico Union based, right? So what was the difference between these youth and the hundreds of thousands, right, that didn't go down this path, right? And a lot of them, it was really interesting because it's contact with these CBOs. A lot of it has to do with geographic space, a lot of it has to do with chance, a lot of it has to do with family networks. But I found that these community organizations were doing that work, that parallel work that schools in that community weren't doing. And I always, talk about folks that are doing Central American research in Pomona or in the San Gabriel Valley. I grew up in the valley. I didn't have that same, it's funny because whenever I've done poetry with this group, Epicentro, I always say I'm the one that didn't grow up in Pico Union, right? And somehow, because of my higher education, I was able to come into contact with this group that gave me a different sense of my own identity. So that's something that I think played a role in this community.
Well, I want to thank Areli. I know there's several more questions, and I definitely don't want to dismiss them. Let's definitely ask them and have a conversation over food, which is inviting everybody over to the parlor. We have some wonderful pupusas catered by Platano, our local restaurant here. I also want to thank our CLPR staff, Alejandro, who's in the back, Rosa, who's here. Our digital media specialist with CLPR, who is not here right now, but she's a big part of this as well. So I want to thank everybody, and again, Adeni, thank you so much. And please join us for food. We can